Welcome back, Bio30 Prep. We're going to continue our discussion of the respiratory system. In this lecture, we are going to be talking about breathing and respiration. In your textbook, it's pages 249 to 262. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to explain the mechanics of inspiration and expiration in terms of changing pressure. You'll be able to explain the mechanism behind gas exchange. You'll be able to describe how oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported through the circulatory system. You'll be able to describe how the rate of respiration is regulated by the human body. And we'll talk about the symptoms and causes of some respiratory disorders. So when we look at breathing, a lot of the times people think we suck air in kind of through our nose or suck it in with our throat or chest muscles. What we're actually doing, however, is changing air pressure in our lungs. The muscle that causes air to enter our lungs and escape our lungs has nothing to do with our nose or throat. It's all based on the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a large elastic muscle, and what happens is when it pulls, when you flex your diaphragm, it pulls down, increasing the space inside of your chest. And so what that does is gases move from an area of high pressure to one of low pressure. Inspiration occurs when the pleural pressure, or the pressure inside of your lungs, is less than the atmospheric pressure. So if you can imagine, when you inhale, it creates a large space inside of your chest, and air is going to naturally want to rush into that space to fill it up. The diaphragm pulls in the lungs, and it increases chest volume, and air flows into that space. It flows in through your nose, down your throat, or your trachea, down your bronchi, and into your lungs. And this is how your lungs fill with air. So your lungs fill with air all based on the movement of the diaphragm. Expiration, or breathing out, occurs when the pleural pressure is greater than the atmospheric pressure. So when the air pressure inside of your lungs is higher than the pressure of the atmosphere, air is forced out of your body into the surrounding air. And that happens when your diaphragm relaxes. It raises up, it squeezes on the lung tissue, and actually pushes it, or it reduces the space inside of your chest, forcing air back out. We can also increase our chest volume with our ribs. Our ribs are lined with intercostal muscles. The intercostal muscles raise or lower the ribs, which is going to increase or decrease chest volume depending on the situation. So increasing, it can also be decreasing as well. And the intercostal muscles are controlled by autonomic nerves. We don't have to really think about breathing until we actually talk about it. So I'm sure listening to this lecture, you're thinking about every breath you take. But before that, you weren't really concerned with when you were inhaling or exhaling. All these muscles, the diaphragm and all the intercostals, are controlled by autonomic nerves or automatic nerves, nerves that you don't have to think about. They just do their thing. Before we can talk about what happens in terms of how does oxygen actually get from the air around us into every single one of our cells, what we need to look at are some gas properties or physical properties of gases. So Avogadro, his hypothesis was that equal volumes of gas at the same temperature contain the same number of molecules, or because gases are so small, when we talk about atoms are tiny, tiny little particles, and we know that gases are particles that are really spread out, lots of space between them. So in terms of gases, all gas molecules are about the same size, therefore they take up the same amount of space. It doesn't matter if it's a oxygen gas, carbon dioxide gas, argon gas, carbon monoxide gas. All of these substances take up the same space with the same number of molecules. Think about a bag of marbles, and these are just different colored marbles. Each marble takes up exactly the same amount of space. It doesn't matter what color the marble is. The other one that we got to think about, or the other law that we should know, is Dalton's law of partial pressures. And I guess the complicated version is that each gas in a mixture exerts its own pressure, which is proportional to the total volume. And all that really means is that if 23% of a sample of air is oxygen, then 23% of the pressure exerted by that air is from the oxygen molecules. So the math for it is quite simple. If the air pressure is 110 kilopascals, and we know that that air is 23% oxygen molecules, then that means 25 of those 110 kilopascals are a result of just the oxygen molecules. Another way to say it is that if you removed all the other molecules from the air, then the pressure would be reduced to 25 kilopascals. And the math for it, and we're not going to have to worry about the math for it, but it's just something that we should know. All we're doing is going 0.23 or 23% times 110 kilopascals, and that's how we get our 25. Gases move from areas of high pressure to low pressure. This is very similar to the idea of diffusion. So gases spread out to fill their spaces. So if there's a large clump of gas molecules in one area, or say being contained in a container, they spread out to areas of low pressure. One way to think about this is if you have a propane tank or a barbecue. When you turn that barbecue on, the gas hisses out, and what's happening is inside that propane tank, the gas molecules are extremely close together, high pressure inside your propane tank. As soon as you open the valve and turn on your barbecue, those gas molecules are escaping out to an area of lower pressure. And the same principle can be used when we talk about the movement of oxygen molecules and carbon dioxide molecules. It turns out that the pressure of oxygen in the air is higher than the pressure of oxygen inside of each one of our body cells. So oxygen naturally is going to diffuse, and this is the important part, from the lungs into our bloodstream, and even from our bloodstream into cells, because the concentration or the pressure of oxygen inside of our body cells is always low. Cells use oxygen to do cellular respiration as part of their metabolism, so it's always being used up. So the pressure of oxygen inside cells is very, very low. For carbon dioxide, the reverse is true. Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into our blood, and then from blood into our lungs, and then we exhale it or expire it out of our lungs. And it's the same idea. Carbon dioxide is constantly being built up in our cells. When cells do metabolic activities, they produce lots of carbon dioxide. So the concentration or the pressure of carbon dioxide is very high inside of our body cells. It diffuses out to our bloodstream, and from our bloodstream it diffuses out into our lungs and then out into the air, because the pressure of carbon dioxide in air is only about 0.93% in the atmosphere. So there isn't a lot of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, so it's able to diffuse from our blood into our lungs, and then when we breathe it out, it diffuses out into the atmosphere around us. So this is a picture of what gas exchange looks like. Respiration. So respiration is the act of gas exchange, which is different than breathing. Breathing is inspiration, or inhalation if you like, and expiration. That's what breathing is. It's simply the motion of the muscles. It's air into and out of our lungs. Respiration is something different. Respiration is the exchange of gases between our alveoli and our blood, and between body cells and our blood. So there's two types of respiration. There's external respiration, and this occurs inside the lung tissue. So it's, even though it's called external, it's really still inside our body. It's happening at our alveoli. So if we take a look at this picture on the right here, each one of these white spaces is an alveolus. So when we breathe in, they fill up with air. When we breathe out, the air is pushed out into the environment. But when we breathe in, or even before we breathe in our blood vessels, there's a buildup of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is always moving from the blood into the alveolus. And oxygen, when we breathe in, then we fill up with oxygen-rich air. That oxygen moves from our alveolus into our blood. And this is mostly based on diffusion, concentrations and pressure. So external respiration, it occurs in the lungs. It's the gas exchange between the alveoli and capillaries that surround the alveoli. The oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood. The carbon dioxide, it's the reverse. It goes from the blood to the alveoli. Once that blood becomes oxygen rich, it ends up traveling out to the rest of our body cells. So internal respiration is what's happening in the rest of our body tissue. It's happening in our muscle cells, our skin cells, nerve cells, every other cell in the body needs oxygen. So as that oxygen-rich blood travels out to every single one of the cells in our body, the oxygen diffuses into those cells. So here there's a picture of muscle cells. Muscles use a lot of oxygen because they need a lot of energy, because they're the cells that actually keep us in motion. So oxygen is going out to the body cells. Carbon dioxide is always being produced in those body cells. It's being pushed back out into the capillaries. So that carbon dioxide, so now this blood is going to end up flowing back eventually to the lungs, where the reverse can happen. And then once it fills up with oxygen again, it flows back over to our body cells. And again, oxygen is dumped out, carbon dioxide taken in, back up to the lungs. Carbon dioxide is pushed out, oxygen is taken in, back and forth. Millions of times, hundreds of thousands of times a day. There's one more type of respiration, that's cellular respiration, and we're not going to talk a lot about it in this course, but this is the process where the oxygen is actually being used up. So it's the process that's happening inside of our cells, inside the mitochondria, actually, that organelle of each one of our cells. We're using oxygen and we're producing carbon dioxide. The purpose is to get the energy out of glucose, to get that energy into a form that's usable by our body. But in terms of respiration, this is where the oxygen and carbon dioxide are actually switching places, or where the oxygen is being used up and the carbon dioxide is being produced. When we actually look at the oxygen inside of our blood, so the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in the atmosphere than it is in the capillaries. The opposite is true for carbon dioxide. So we talked about this a little bit a couple slides earlier. This is going to cause oxygen to move into arteries and then into the tissues, because the pressure in arteries is less than the pressure in the atmosphere, and the pressure inside of our body tissues is less than the pressure inside of our arteries. Complete reverse for carbon dioxide. Once oxygen enters our blood, it's transported from the alveoli into blood capillaries by facilitated diffusion. So that means there's either carrier molecules or carrier proteins, or channel proteins in the cell walls of our blood vessels, pushing all this pushing all this oxygen into our blood. So a protein molecule carries the O2 from the alveoli through the capillary wall into the blood. Once the oxygen gets into the blood, it's going to bond to hemoglobin molecules, and we've all probably heard of hemoglobin before. This is a protein, the most abundant protein in our body, and it's going to form a complex called oxyhemoglobin, oxy for the oxygen, hemoglobin for the hemoglobin protein. And what this does is it drops the pressure of oxygen in our lungs. Basically what we're doing is we're maximizing storage space. So this whole process here is to maximize O2 into the blood. We want to get as much oxygen into our blood as possible so that we can feed it to all of our body cells. When we talk about oxygen transport, it's pretty much transported entirely on hemoglobin. Not all of it's used up the first time it goes through our body. Blood coming back in our veins, so blood that's coming back to the lungs is still about 70% saturated with oxygen. This is one of the reasons we can hold our breath for more than 30 seconds. Once blood goes through once, it's about 70% saturated. If we're holding our breath, it's going to be pumped through our body again, and it will go down to about 40 or 30% saturated, and so on, until once it's empty, we're going to be forced to inhale to get fresh oxygen into our body. Carbon dioxide transport's a little bit different. There's a few ways carbon dioxide can be transported through our body or through our circulatory system. So about 9% dissolves directly in the plasma. This is the same way you'd see it in pop. Just gaseous carbon dioxide dissolved in blood, dissolved in water. 23% is carried by hemoglobin. So it turns out that carbon dioxides can bond to hemoglobin, but it's much less efficient than oxygen. Only about 23% of the carbon dioxide in our blood is actually bonded to the hemoglobin. The rest, and this is the important one, so the first two, if you don't remember, nobody will know that you don't remember most likely, but this is the one you want to pay attention to. Most of the carbon dioxide, about 70% of it, reacts with the water molecules that are in our blood plasma. So our blood is full of water. The carbon dioxide actually reacts with it to form bicarbonate ions. And this is how most of it is traveling through our blood as it travels from our tissue back up to our lungs. The chemical reaction for it is right here. Here's our carbon dioxide molecule. It gets produced by a cell. It mixes with the water in our blood. It produces carbonic acid. And the carbonic acid dissociates and forms bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. But here's what's happening. CO2 acidifies blood. It increases the acid level of our blood. Not by much. I mean, our blood still sits around just above 7 in terms of its pH. But the CO2 acidifies the blood. It's aided by an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, increasing the reaction rate by about a factor of 3,000. So it really increases the rate at which this happens. If you just have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but trying to dissolve carbon dioxide just in water normally, very, very slow. But in our blood, it happens quite quickly with the action of this enzyme. What this does is it keeps the concentration of CO2 in the blood low. The CO2 is no longer a molecule that's on its own. It exists as something else, which allows more CO2 to diffuse into the blood. So we're always trying to get more and more CO2 into our blood so that when it gets up to our lungs, we can exhale it out. A very efficient way of getting rid of this metabolic waste. As the carbon dioxide in the blood reaches the lungs, the reaction reverses. So we have, where did my pen go? We have this bicarbonate ion, and it's just a complete reverse reaction. It turns back into carbonic acid. It then breaks up into water and carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide gets to go out into the atmosphere because we're going to exhale it out or expire it out. Now this all gets regulated by our brain. 99.9% of the time, we don't think about breathing. I mean, when we're sleeping, we're breathing. Most of the time when we're awake, we're breathing and not even thinking about it. So it's autonomic or automatic. It's controlled by the medulla oblongata. There's two sets of chemoreceptors. And when you see the word chemoreceptor, receptor is just something that detects the presence or absence of something. And chemo is short for chemical. So they're chemical receptors, chemoreceptors. They're sensory cells that monitor chemical concentrations in our blood. In this case, they're going to be monitoring the oxygen level, and the oxygen, carbon dioxide are chemicals. We just don't. Sometimes we use the word chemical for things that are just bad, but all molecules are chemicals. These chemoreceptors are going to be monitoring oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, and more specifically, bicarbonate levels. The one monitoring the carbon dioxide and bicarbonate levels, it's located right in the medulla oblongata. It's the more sensitive one. It's actually the one that controls when you breathe in. So what happens is that carbon dioxide has been converted into bicarbonate ions. As the level of bicarbonate builds up, the chemoreceptors react to an increase in acidity. So as bicarbonate levels rise, the medulla oblongata stimulates the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles to contract. So the diaphragm contracts, the intercostals contract, and that increases the volume of your chest. causing air to flow in to your body. The less sensitive one, kind of the backup system, is the one that monitors oxygen. It's located in the aorta and the carotid bodies. The carotid bodies are arteries that are underneath your collarbone. They respond to low levels of O2. It's a secondary system since most of the time our body's responding to high acid levels or high carbon dioxide levels instead. It's going to function, or it's going to kick in when the CO2 levels are unrelated to our oxygen levels. So for example, if we're suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning, CO2 levels aren't going to change very much because we're not producing more CO2. But what's happening is there isn't as much oxygen bonded to hemoglobin. Remember, carbon monoxide is a competitive inhibitor with oxygen. So it competes with oxygen for spots on hemoglobin, and it's actually better at bonding to hemoglobin than oxygen is. So it fills up the hemoglobins, not allowing us to get oxygen into our body. We breathe in, but because our hemoglobin's full, the oxygen never makes it into our blood. So it's a competitive inhibitor with oxygen. If we're suffering from something like carbon monoxide poisoning, the secondary system will kick in, and we'll find our breathing rate increases as we try to compensate for the lower oxygen levels. So here's a picture of the medulla oblongata. It's right at the top of, or I guess the top of the holy moly, spinal cord. That's the word I'm looking for. So there's the medulla oblongata. And it looks like it's part of the spinal cord. It's actually up. It's still up in the brain. I mean, the brain case, or the cranium, ends right about here. So it's still inside the cranium, and it is part of the brain itself. It's right up at the top of the spinal cord. The medulla oblongata, it controls most of our automatic responses. You'll spend more time in Bio30 talking about brain and areas of the brain, so it's a good idea to get familiar with when you see some brain names or nervous system names to keep them in your back pocket, because you're going to be using them in Bio30. So in terms of homeostasis, here's kind of the way it would look. Cells are producing carbon dioxide all the time because of cellular respiration. This increases the concentration of bicarbonate ions in our blood, and it's also going to increase bicarbonate ions. It also increases just the carbonic acid concentrations as well. As more CO2 dissolves in our blood, fewer of them turn into bicarbonate ions. So the chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata sense that we are short, or high, I should say, high in carbon dioxide. It triggers the diaphragm to contract and the intercostal muscles. The response is inhalation. So we breathe in, we get a bunch of fresh oxygen into our body, carbon dioxide starts diffusing into our alveoli, and then we breathe out. This is going to decrease the acid levels in our blood. And so now the stimulus is gone, so we won't breathe again until acid levels build up one more time. In terms of disorders, most respiratory disorders are infections. Bronchitis is a narrowing of air passageways caused by bacterial or viral infections, or it can be a reaction to a chemical in the environment. It results in an increase of mucus. So what's happened is bacteria or a virus has attached itself to the bronchus. It's reproducing there, and what your body's trying to do is produce mucus so that it can be pushed out and coughed out of your body. If it gets deep into the bronchioles, it can be serious because there's no cartilage holding them open. And what can actually happen is all that mucus and bacteria, the weight of it all, can actually start closing off those bronchial tubes because they just get so heavy and so full of mucus that they seal right up, and then air can't pass to alveoli. So it increases the resistance to air both into and out of the lungs. Bronchial asthma and emphysema are examples of a bronchitis. Emphysema is a chronic bronchitis, and what happens is it decreases the diameter of the bronchioles, causing increased air pressure in the lungs. And the idea is every time we breathe in, we decrease that pleural pressure in our lungs, lots of air gets in, but when we breathe back out, we can't decrease the pressure enough to get all of that air back out, and so a little bit stays behind. Then we breathe in again, nice big deep breath. Those alveoli fill up a little bit more than they did the last time. Again, we breathe out, and they don't quite lose all the air. And it's kind of like slowly inflating a balloon. You let lots of air in, don't let as much air out. Lots of air in, don't let as much air out. And eventually, it causes those alveoli to burst because they too much air pressure. Too much air inside the alveoli, they burst, and less alveoli means less gas exchange with blood vessels. So as those alveoli start to burst, we start to have less of an ability to get oxygen out to all of our cells. Lung cancer, it's the most common cause of cancer deaths in Canadian men, third most common for women, and what it really is uncontrolled cell growth in the lungs. So basically what happens is some of those lung cells get mutated, they stop working as lung cells, and just start reproducing on their own. They go through mitosis after mitosis after mitosis, making a great big lump in your chest cavity. And as that lump grows, it fills up space that should be taken up by alveoli. And it basically just drowns out those cells. It starts to grow and grow and grow until there's no more room for your lungs to expand. They expand just into that solid surface of cells, and we can't get enough air into our body for efficient gas exchange. Here's some pictures of where some infections happen. Pneumonia is when the alveoli fill with a thick fluid, making gas exchange difficult. Again, it can be caused by bacteria or virus. Viral usually clears itself up. It goes away. Bacterial, you'll treat with antibiotics, and that should get rid of it. Bronchitis, inflammation due to infection, or it can be because of an irritant. Smoking is a cause of bronchitis. Basically, your cells produce lots and lots of mucus. Notice they're showing you where these infections happen. So, where's my little pen here? Here we go. Pneumonia in the alveoli. Bronchitis is in the bronchial tubes, or the bronchioles, or we can go with the bronchus. Asthma is an inflammation due to irritation. The bronchioles basically constrict due to muscle spasms. And what happens is an asthmatic reaction actually triggers the bronchioles to close. It thinks that something foreign is trying to get into the body, and the best way to defend itself is to simply shut off the opening to the body. So it squeezes all those bronchioles closed. Of course, when that happens, we don't get air or oxygen into our body, and our cellular respiration is compromised. Emphysema we talked about a little bit, but same idea. These alveoli burst and fuse into enlarged air spaces, and really what's happening is we're getting a reduced surface area. Less area for gas exchange, lower lung volume. So for a summary, here's what you should get from this lecture. Inspiration occurs when air pressure inside our lungs, or the pleural pressure, is less than the air pressure outside of our lungs, the atmospheric pressure. And this is caused when the diaphragm contracts. The diaphragm contracts, creates lots of space, air pressure drops inside of our lungs, and we can inhale air. Expiration is the reverse. When the pleural pressure is higher than the atmospheric pressure, air is forced back out. And this happens when our diaphragm relaxes and our intercostals relax. It closes up our chest volume, increasing the pressure, forcing that air out. Carbon dioxide, oxygen, they diffuse into and out of tissues based on relative partial pressures. Or another way, it's not quite right, but I like the idea of diffusion. And basically, you can think about even just concentrations. The concentration of oxygen inside of our tissues is always low. We're using it up all the time. The concentration of carbon dioxide inside of our tissues is always high. We're producing it all the time. And so oxygen, the partial pressure, is always decreasing as we move from the atmosphere to our body cells. For carbon dioxide, the partial pressure is always decreasing as we move from our cells out to the atmosphere. Oxygen travels in our circulatory system bound to hemoglobin. That's its primary transport method through our circulatory system. The primary method for carbon dioxide is it travels through our blood as bicarbonate ions. Respiratory rates are regulated by the medulla oblongata, which is monitoring the acidity of our blood plasma. High levels of carbon dioxide increases acidity, causes inspiration. And that's pretty much it for the respiratory system. So in your next lecture, we'll be starting on circulation.